Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Nyemka. I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose Bookstore, where we host a range of in person events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. Can you not hear us? Yeah. Okay. Can you get the volume, please? Testing. Is that better? All right, we're going to start again. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Nyemka. I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose Bookstore, where we host a range of in store events along with trips and classes. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at this microphone to ask your questions. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Musa Al-Gharbi to talk about his book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Al-Gharbi is a sociologist and an assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. He is a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, along with other publications. Al-Gharbi will be in conversation with Shadi Hamid. Hamid is a columnist at The Washington Post and a research professor of Islamic Studies at Fuller Seminary. He is also the co-founder of Wisdom of Crowds, a podcast, newsletter, and debate platform. He's the author, most recently, of The Problem of Democracy. So please join me in welcoming Musa Al-Gharbi and Shadi Hamid.
Okay. Testing. Good. Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us, and we have a very special guest. I'm not just saying this because I'm the moderator. I guess we usually say the book is great and all of that, but in this case, I really do mean it. This is a big, ambitious work. There's a lot in there, and you guys should all buy copies. That goes without saying, obviously. Um, so I was actually just reading a review of the book in the Washington Post, and the reviewer there called Musa one of the most insightful and provocative sociologists of his generation. Those are big words right there. I think they're well deserved. So it's a pleasure to have you, Musa, and looking forward to this conversation. Maybe just to get us started, the title is intriguing. We have never been woke. What could that possibly mean? So maybe just to start us off, tell us who is the we in We Have Never Been Woke, and why have we never been woke?
Sure. So the title of the book is actually a play on a different book by a different sociologist, Bruno Latour. He had this book called We Have Never Been Modern. And the argument that Latour made is that the story that kind of modern people tell themselves about what sets them apart from everyone else, these make it hard for us to understand the nature of the modern world and make it difficult to address the problems of modernity. And so in the same way, I tell the argument of this book is that the stories that symbolic capitalists, and I'll return to who they are in just 1 second, the stories that symbolic capitalists tell ourselves about how we're allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history and so on. These make it difficult for us to understand how various social problems come about and persist and who benefits from them and how. And so the we and We Have Never Been Woke is this group of folks I call symbolic capitalists. They've been known by other names in other places: the professional managerial class, the creative class, class X, the new class, a lot of class words. And basically, they're people who make a living by producing and manipulating symbols and data instead of producing physical or providing physical goods and services to people. So think people who are like college professors or journalists or people who work in consulting or finance or science and technology, arts and entertainment, and so on. So fields like that where you're involved in the production and manipulation of symbols and data and rhetoric and so on.
Okay. And one point that really comes through right at the very start is this question that you pose. Why is it that elites, the symbolic capitalists, the professional class that I think most of us, for better or worse, are part of, why are we so eager to paint ourselves as victims and to do the kind of performative woke stuff that you are, I think, somewhat critical of? And there's something odd about this because we are the people who are highly educated, quite successful. We are the winners in broader American society, yet we refuse to see ourselves as such. We're elites who don't want to be elites, and we're elites who want to apparently be victims. So there is something contradictory about that. And one example you give that I think is very telling, and it might be relevant actually on Tuesday, depending on how the election goes. You bring up the night of Trump's victory in 2016, and then you were at Columbia at the time, and you were seeing how students were reacting the days after. And this is what you write early in the book. You say this, quote, "Although the classrooms were full of tears in the days that followed, one never saw the janitors making a scene, sobbing uncontrollably about politics as they scrubbed rich kids' messes out of the toilets." End quote. I think there's something powerful about that. I cried on election day, and I feel a little bit sheepish about that in retrospect. But I think a lot of us were very distraught. But then the people who were most marginalized, the actual so-called victims of society, they weren't crying, they weren't sobbing, they were getting along with their days and working hard and trying to get things done and taking care of their families. We were the ones who were freaking out. So maybe just help us unpack this idea of how the winners of society want to be victims. What is driving that, and wanting to associate ourselves so much with the most marginalized, even though we ourselves are not marginalized?
Yeah, I mean, so part of the story that I tell in the book there is that a lot of the professions that we take part in have defined themselves from the beginning in terms of altruism and serving the common good. So people who work in a lot of these professions, we get more money than most people. We have a lot more autonomy than most people. So much more autonomy, a lot more prestige. And from the beginning, we've said the reason you should give us these things is because if you do that, it will be to the benefit of everyone, especially the marginalized and the disadvantaged. So, and a lot of our professions are justified explicitly this way. So journalists, for instance, are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. So this very altruistic. Professors are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and tell the truth without regards to anyone's economic or political interests and so on. So the fact that our professions and our pay and prestige and so on were justified in this way created this unique form of status competition within the professions that's been going on for 100 years now, where if you're really effective at portraying yourself as being deeply committed to these kind of to serving the marginalized and the disadvantaged and helping society and improving the common good and so on, then you seem especially worthy of status and power and things like that. And on the other hand, if you're successfully painted as having the wrong views about the wrong people or having the wrong motives and so on, you can find your position in these professions precarious or even lose your job. And this is, again, been true for 100 years. This isn't something that started with Twitter. One thing that changed and more recently is that in the aftermath of things like Title IX and affirmative action, a lot of these professions, which before were sinecures for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, they were explicitly only for those people. If you were black, if you were a woman, if you were Jewish or something like that, you were just not, like they tried to lock you out. So that changed after Title IX and affirmative action and related policies. And this kind of complicated the status competition because all of a sudden you had new people entering these professions who weren't able to just simply claim that they were advocates or allies of the marginalized and the disadvantaged. They could say they are literally like physical embodiments of this marginalization and disadvantage. And so this created a kind of arms race where today a lot of elites try to find all sorts of different ways that they can count themselves as among the marginalized and the disadvantaged, often stretching the truth in many cases to do so.
So in a way, you're saying that these elites, this professional class, they are performing wokeness as a way to gain status, as a way to confirm their moral superiority. and they're not actually doing a lot to help the people that they claim to be helping. But I think you actually go one step further and you say that they actually, in their everyday lives, are undermining and exploiting the very people that they claim to be on the side of. And that there's a deeper set of capitalist relations there that depend on that exploitation. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, one of the puzzles that the book unpacks is that the people who are most preoccupied with what you might call ideological sexism or ideological racism, that is, people thinking or feeling or saying the wrong things about women or minorities and so on. They're also the people who benefit the most from what sociologists describe as systemic or institutionalized racism. So we're the ones who benefit the most from gendered inequalities, racialized inequalities. Um, so, for instance, um, in a lot of an example that I explore looking at gendered inequalities. So it turns out, so a lot of the symbolic professions are very committed to feminism on paper and committed to kind of improving the prospects of women. But when you look at things like gender disparities within the symbolic professions, they're actually much starker than they are in a lot of other fields. And in a lot of households, in the symbolic professions, you have both partners, heterosexual households, you have both partners that are out there working. Well, part of the reason why you can have this kind of dual income arrangement and where people can profit off the dual income arrangement is because there's still all of what used to be called women's work is still being done by women. It's just outsourced to other women. So you have other women taking care of your kids, other women often cooking and preparing your house, your food, other women caring for the elderly and the sick, other women preparing meals, and so on. And the reason why you can turn a profit despite buying all of this labor, the way that you can actually make a profit despite buying all of this other women's work, is because a lot of these women are underpaid. Underpaid relative to if these people were doing this work themselves, were trying to get compensated for doing this work themselves. Underpaid relative to, in fact, oftentimes people in cities like Manhattan on the Upper West Side where I live to go out of their way to find undocumented immigrants, basically, and pay them under the table much less than they would pay and it's not like there's some rule that even if you're hiring someone who's an undocumented immigrant, there's no rule that says you have to pay them less than a native-born kind of white person. That's a choice that we make. That's a choice that people make. They choose to target someone whose legal position in the country is vulnerable and precarious and pay them less than they would pay someone who is a citizen. That's a choice they make. No one's forcing them to do that, right? And so a lot of this, there's a story that you can look at some of these shifts along gender and see it as a story of women's empowerment. And there's a sense in which it is. But certain women have been empowered and they've been able to be empowered largely by exploiting other women. And that's kind of an unfortunate reality, but it's a reality that I explore in the book.
On one level, I think your book is a sort of searing indictment of the professional class, but in other ways, I think it's fair and even sympathetic. And let me just explain what I mean by that. Is you say that it's not really that they're hypocrites, or you say that they are hypocrites only in the sense that we're all hypocrites because we can never live up to our own ideals, and that's not unique to the professional class. We all struggle with that. So you're actually taking for granted that these people are sincere. They're not being purely cynical. And they really believe what they say for the most part. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how hypocrisy plays into your assessment of the professional class? What does it mean when you say that these people are being sincere, and how much does it matter that they're being sincere? Because I think when a lot of us hear about sincerity, we think about that positively. But I think your point is sincerity isn't necessarily something we need to value all that much if it doesn't lead to good outcomes for people who are actually
Yeah, I mean, so Yeah, one of the key things that, like in the culture wars, people like to talk about hypocrisy. You know, there's the Spider-Man meme where two Spider-Mans are pointing at each other, and you could do that and just put hypocrisy under that, and that's basically kind of the culture wars, right? People like to point out the other people and say they're hypocrites. I don't think hypocrisy is interesting, like analytically, um, and so the book does point out that there is this huge gap between what symbolic capitalists profess and what we do and how we live our lives and how our organizations are structured. But the point of the book isn't to point out that gap and make people feel bad and go, you're hypocrites. Like the point of that is like what the book is trying to do is understand how various social problems come about and persist and who benefits from them and how. And in the course of explaining that story, this gap becomes apparent. And the gap matters, the gap between how we behave and how we act matters. It matters in a practical sense because symbolic capitalists are elites. And so the ways that we conduct ourselves in the world have like non-trivial impacts for people who are less advantaged in society. But yeah, the error that we see in the culture wars a lot of times is there's this tendency to say like, oh, well, if I can show that you have an interest in saying or believing something, then aha, you must be insincere. You've been exposed, right? And I think that's kind of a bad way to think about thinking. So in the cognitive and behavioral sciences and adjacent fields, the picture of the brain, of human cognition that we have, is that people tend to perceive and think about the world in these fundamentally self-interested ways. So everything that from the very foundation of us taking in sense data to how we think about everything, we think about it in these self-interested ways. And if we take that seriously, if we take that premise seriously, then we can see that there's not actually a contradiction between believing something sincerely and having an interest in it. If you have an interest in believing something, you're more likely to believe it sincerely. You're more likely to try to get other people to believe it too. And so this kind of game where people go, aha, you have an interest in believing something, therefore you're cynical. I think that's just a bad way of understanding what's actually going on here.
And it reminds me a little bit of the Seinfeld episode where there's no such thing as a selfless good deed. Some of you might recall that one, but I think it gets at something pretty important, which is like even when we do things that seem really good, like helping an old person across the street, that's just what came to mind right now. You're still doing good things because they make you feel good. There is always an emotional self-interest to everything that we do. No one is actually doing something for completely altruistic reasons in the end, and that's a universal thing.
Well, in this point about how I don't think actually like your feelings and motives and stuff matter that. I think people actually overemphasize things like sincerity and again focusing on hearts and minds and things like this. This point you made, like a key argument of the book, is that if you feel something passionately, fervently in your heart, but you continue to, but you don't act on it, right? So you can have a belief that's sincere, but that's not a priority. So you can sincerely be committed to something, but it's just not your number one thing. And actually, this is the argument that I make in the book: is that symbolic capitalists are sincerely committed to social justice and egalitarianism, but that's not our only sincere commitment. We're also sincerely committed to being an elite, which is to say, we think that our opinions should carry more weight than those of everyone else. Like, I think that my opinions on whatever, people should take them more seriously than the person checking me out at the grocery store. Or or a lot of us think that we should be paid more than the person pumping our gas. If you're in New Jersey, I guess, where they still do that, and things like that. And so this point that we should have more influence than other people, that we think that we should have a higher standard of living than other people, that we want our kids to reproduce our own position or do even better. And these goals are in tension, right? You can't really be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms.
But clearly you can, because there are egalitarian social climbers. So it's doable. You just have to live with the contradictions.
Yeah, well, and this is the point: is you can't pursuing both of those things. So we have these two sincere commitments to be an elite, to be an egalitarian, and when they come into conflict, as they often do, It's usually the desire to be an elite that ends up kind of winning out, winning the day, transforming in some way, supervening how we pursue social justice, leading us to pursue these social justice goals in ways that don't require us to change anything or sacrifice anything, mostly by trying to expropriate, blame, and extract resources from other people. Sometimes people who benefit from the system a lot less than we do, um, and uh, and push us to taking these kinds of symbolic gestures that allow us to feel like we're doing something, that we're on the right side of things, even if we're not actually doing anything that provides tangible benefit to people who are genuinely vulnerable and desperate in society.
Yeah, so I want to raise a couple examples that you raise on the local and national level of this kind of hypocrisy. And I want to push you a little bit and ask you what you think. How do we? Is it possible to close the gap, and what would it look like to close the gap? So you say that um, members of the professional class, they like to live in diverse cities. They like to see diversity from afar, but they generally don't want to send their kids to diverse public schools. That would seem to be a contradiction. You also bring up the example of feminist women who say that other women should feel comfortable with their bodies in whatever way they see fit and not worry about conventional attractiveness, but it's those feminist elite women who are most likely to have elective cosmetic procedures, for example, and to really value their own looks and to go to the gym a lot and so forth. Another example on the level of a state, California. California is pretty much a one-party state, completely dominated by Democrats. So you'd think it would be a kind of utopia, but apparently, from what I hear, it's not. And it has some of the worst poverty rates and homelessness in the country, some of the worst educational and housing disparities. So those are three examples. Is it possible to close those gaps? Should we expect people to close those gaps? So let's take the example of sending your kids to public school.
Yeah.
Is that a reasonable expectation?
Sure, yeah. So it's a reasonable expectation. That's what I did. So I have two kids. I have a son who's 13. I have a daughter who's about to be 10. I lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. There was a public school there, PS 165. It was mentioned in a J.D. Salinger book. But anyway, so it's I'm in a bookstore. I'm looking at books. So, but the school is 70% Black and Hispanic, overwhelmingly low-income people. But I just sent. I'm a product of public schools. My wife's a product of public schools. We just sent our kid to the public school. But there weren't that many Columbia people who did that. Whether you're talking about graduate students or professors, they overwhelmingly choose to send their kids to private schools. Often private schools where you have to pay tens of thousands of dollars per year to get in. Often that have these really robust social justice curriculums. And the thing about it is, so sending your kids to your zone public school is actually one of these easy, like low-hanging fruit things. So it actually would matter. It would matter for a lot of reasons if more people did this. It's not just about the extra couple dollars they'd get for an extra butt in the chair. There's all this research that shows when you have people forming relationships across class lines like this, it can be life-changing for less advantaged students. It can cause them to have new models for behavior, different modes of aspiration. It can impart to them different kinds of cultural capital that they wouldn't have other places. Get them involved sometimes, like if these parents are participating in the PTAs the way they participate in the private school PTAs. They could have all sorts of enrichment opportunities that they provide, right? So like the benefits for less advantaged people could be significant if parents just chose to do that, just send their kids to the zone public school. And it's even easier. instead of paying tens of thousands and doing all this application, thing, you just yield to the default. Nothing could be easier, at least easier on paper. But it's also hard. It's hard in the sense that it requires you to invest your own child in trying to solve this problem. And for a lot of people, so there's all sorts of research that shows if you're someone from a relatively affluent background, whether you send your kid to an elite school or a non-elite school, your kid's going to probably actually end up just the same. If there's studies that show for people who get into UPenn, which is an Ivy school, and Penn State, who get into both, if they choose to go to Penn State, their outcomes are actually the same as if they went to the Ivy. And that's because a lot of the things that you would get from going to these elite schools, they already have. And the elite schools are really transformative for people from non-traditional backgrounds to get folded in. Okay, so the problem is, for a lot of parents, even if you present them this research and they think, okay, there's like if I send my kid to the zone public school, it might reduce their chances of getting into Harvard by like 5%, or it might reduce their life income by like 5%, which or there's a 10% chance that maybe they'll fall in with the wrong crowd or something like that, right? Like, even if it's just 5%, 10%, are you going to roll that dice with your kids? A lot of people say no. Like that's the conclusion they come
like,
to.
Why put that to chance?
Well, again, there's a lot that you can't control in this life, and at some point you have to. So again, with my own children, I sent them to the zone public school, and they did great. They had a lot of friends. They succeeded. They flourished. My son's doing, they're cool people doing great things. And so I think, and actually, and part of the thing too is like the way that a lot of these upper middle class people try to approach risk, the ways that they try to control everything and they're actually giving a lot of their children anxiety and depression and things like that as well. Like it's not actually doing good for their kids. Actually, if they just chilled out and took some more risks and things like that, actually their children would probably be happier. In addition to the fact that sending them to the zone public school probably wouldn't have a negative consequence in more material ways, but like this concern, this preoccupation with maximization and this avoidance of risk is just actually an unhealthy, making everyone miserable, the parents, the children. Sometimes you just let go and let God.
Yeah. And I want to just zoom out now to some of the national implications when it comes to our two-party system, that in the past few decades, the professional class has really come to dominate every level of the Democratic Party and shaping the Democratic Party's message in a way that wasn't the case in the 70s or 80s, when it was still at least somewhat a working class party, or there was still an aspiration to be a working class party. It is now not really that. And one of the things that you write is that as a result of this, the Democratic Party is far out of step with the rest of Americans because the professional class possess, quote, idiosyncratic tastes and unusual lifestyles, end quote. Can you maybe unpack what are the implications of being out of step culturally and being seen as an elite that isn't really part of the broader culture or has carved out a very unique niche in the broader culture?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of electoral consequences, one of the things that that's been trending basically over the last decade, as I've shown in some of my columns for The Guardian and elsewhere, is that the Democratic Party has been actually losing consistently, seeing erosion with some of the demographics that were supposed to guarantee them an enduring Democratic majority. So African Americans, for instance, have been moving consistently away from the Democratic Party for the last decade. Hispanics, lower income people, working class people, and the reason why why you're seeing this move away from the Democratic Party is that a lot of these populations didn't vote Democrat to begin with because they're like aggressively culturally liberal, but because the Democratic Party seemed to be better allies on things like civil rights or civil liberties, or because they support robust government safety nets and things like this. But so to the extent that the Democratic Party has de-emphasized that stuff that they agree with and instead like focused on some of this kind of cultural identitarian stuff that gets us fired up and that we care about a lot. One of the effects is that a lot of people who have been voting Democrat for a lot of their life just are under the impression that the party doesn't really care about them, doesn't really care about their values, doesn't really prioritize the things that they care about. In fact, we're foregrounding the things that a lot of these voters disagree with us on. So if you look, for instance, at attitudes towards immigration, some of the sectors of the Democratic coalition that are most skeptical of immigration are Hispanics and African Americans.
Yeah.
And this is true, same if you look at things like who in the Democratic coalition supports like the Muslim ban. It's African Americans and Hispanics are the parts of the Democratic Party that are most likely to support that, because a lot of Black people and Hispanic people are themselves Christians, evangelical Christians. They view Islam as a false and dangerous religion, and if someone wants to do something to have less Muslims in the country, they don't think that's the worst thing in the world. And so on and so forth for a lot of issues. And so one of the things that's interesting is over this same time that Democrats have been seeing attrition with non-white voters, Republicans have actually been seeing consistent attrition with white voters, including the entire time over the last decade, the entire time that Trump has been on the national political scene, Republicans have been losing with white voters. And it's been impossible for us to process this information because of some of the narratives that symbolic capitalists are locked into with respect to race. We can't understand the attrition of non-whites, and we also can't understand Republicans' losses with whites. But the reason why Democrats remain competitive, despite seeing softness with a lot of non-whites, is because they've actually been seeing consistent gains with whites over the last decade.
Yeah, and I wanna touch on Gaza for a moment, because I think that the war in Gaza has scrambled some of our discussion of identity politics. In my own writing, I've been a critic of what might be called wokeness, but I've become a little bit more sympathetic to it over the last year, because it is generally progressive, professional class folks and so-called woke people who have grasped the enormity of the destruction in Gaza, and who have expressed sympathy towards Palestinians, and have recognized what is happening before our own very eyes in that regard. And it kind of brings up an obvious point, that to be woke means that you're more aware and more predisposed to seeing injustices. You're kind of keeping an eye out for them. So that would make you more likely to see the injustices that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people in Gaza. I just want to put that out there and just get your reflections on that. How has Gaza shaped your own thinking on this, and how much does it really intersect with some of these discussions about identity politics? Because I think also in some ways, Gaza has taken over other issues in the progressive landscape, that it has become the kind of new cause célèbre among many progressives, replacing other topics. So
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote an essay about about Gaza and the campus protests before, that people can find on my Substack, extending some of the modes of analysis from the book to this particular case. I think I should say first, in the interest of full disclosure, this is an issue that I'm not as detached as than for other issues that I analyze, in part because my wife is from Lebanon, her family is from the south. They had to flee. They were just driven out of their homes, and they're in Beirut, and Beirut is also getting bombed. So, my wife's family, like good people who I've known, for more than a decade, they could die. They could die like any day now. So one of the things about this whole situation, actually, I think it's a nice illustration of this point, though, about how sympathy and feelings, about the gap between sympathy and feelings and actions. The reality is, despite Democrats and progressives in the Democratic Party saying better things than the kinds of things that Republicans say about this issue, the Democratic Party has been issuing blank checks. Completely, occasionally they wring their hands and they go, "Oh, so sad," but they impose nothing. Ronald Reagan, to set a contrast, Ronald Reagan, when Israel was bombing Lebanon, and Reagan looked at some of the pictures that were coming out of Lebanon. He compared it to a Holocaust. He used that word, and he demanded, not asked, demanded that Israel stop, and they did. Reagan, the Democratic candidate, doesn't have the moral fortitude of Ronald Reagan on this issue. And so one of the changes you see with Kamala Harris compared to Biden is Biden has actually been kind of bad about even offering sympathy. But Harris has been much more about, "Oh, it's so sad, it's so unfortunate, I feel your pain." But at the same time, she's signaled repeatedly that she basically plans to continue her current administration's policy. So, nice sympathy, but, continuing to provide the bombs. All the nice words, as far as the actions and policies, though, a big difference. And this is the in that way, I think this issue is actually emblematic. And so, yeah, Democrats are better, and liberals are more concerned, um, are more likely to be concerned, to express frustration, to express sadness about this issue. But actually, in terms of policy, whether you have Harris in office or Trump in office, it's not actually super obvious to me how big the difference would be. Um, in fact, the Times of Israel reported, they were upset about this because Times of Israel is kind of more right-leaning Mac. But Times of Israel reported that Trump has apparently issued some ultimatum to Netanyahu that if he wins the election, this war needs to be wrapped up before he takes office in January. And they said this is wild because like there's no, in the Times of Israel, a lot of Netanyahu people were like, we can't just end it that fast. There's all these internal constraints or whatever. And this is another example, last thing I'll say, of some of the trends you see with a lot of other non-white voting blocs leaving the Democratic Party. You also see some of this, you might see some of this trend with Arabs and Muslims, because a lot of Arab and Muslim voters have been aligned with the Democratic Party since 2001, but not because they're super culturally progressive, but because the Democrats are viewed as better allies on foreign policy, national security type issues. You have one party that seems like they're out to terraform the Middle East and set up camps and all of this, and you have this other party that seems like they're not into that. But increasingly, under this democratic regime, they've been seeing what's happening in Gaza happen in Gaza, and nothing except, oh, it's so sad. Right, and so a lot of Muslim voters and Arab voters, it seems like they're because the Democratic Party doesn't seem like a reliable ally on the issue that they're actually aligned with them for. It seems like some of them anyway are exploring their options on a range of, and so we might see the same kind of movement that we've been seeing with Black voters, Hispanic voters, and so on. TBD.
Yeah, and just a final question before we open into Q&A. Can you maybe say a little bit about how your own identity played into the writing of the book? I don't know if, I mean, I guess you are a person of color, and I suppose I am as well.
I'm a colorful person,
colorful. But we're brownish to various degrees and so forth. So you are, that means you're coming at it from a particular vantage point. Maybe say a little bit about how your own identity has shaped the writing of the book, and how maybe you even view your own identity, because we've known each other for a little while, but I don't know exactly how you sort of self-describe, and so feel free to take that wherever you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting, so it's definitely the case that one of the things I talk about early in the book is that the book draws from this tradition of kind of Black critique that has been part of the humanities and social sciences since Du Bois, at least, possibly earlier, that looks at how a lot of well-intentioned supporters of civil rights movement are really eager to give platitudes and symbolic actions while continuing to profit from the very things that they decry and not really changing much in terms of their actual behaviors. And so this argument, that aspect of the book, that aspect of the argument, it's a through line that actually pulls deeply from this tradition of Black thought and Black critique. And then similarly, there are aspects of my, I'm a Muslim, there are aspects of my religious faith that also probably shape the book in important ways. So this question of, are we actually helping Muslims have an obligation not just to think the right things, but to do the right, to actually enjoin the good and resist the bad. And so this question of like, well, are we actually doing the things that we say we want to do? That the sharpness of that question, the urgency of that question, probably does have some tie to my religious background. And then the last thing I'll say is I grew up in this military town in a military, from a military family in a state that's kind of reddish. And then I moved, the thing I was doing right before I became a fancy nerd was I was selling shoes. That's what I was doing before I went to Columbia University. And so I had a lot of cultural whiplash from being a small town shoe salesman to being an Ivy League intellectual. And in a city like Manhattan. And so like this kind of cultural whiplash, and I didn't just arrive at any moment. I arrived right before Trump was elected. And so I got into these institutions and this new community. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And then everyone goes, like, loses their mind. Even, and so this some of the questions that the book explores were kind of created in this moment of me trying to figure out, or they're kind of a product of me trying to figure out kind of what's going on here. How do I fit into this picture? How does how do the things I'm observing relate to my own life and my own aspirations? Because again, I'm coming into these professions. I'm at this elite school. I'm pursuing this elite line of work. And so these weren't just intellectual questions. They were also kind of existential questions, right? Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Great. So now we'll open for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you can just line up behind the microphone here. So would you like to start us off?
Yes. So I'm a charter member of the elite. My grandparents were refugees from Eastern Europe. My father was a small businessman, and I'm a physician and an attorney. I'm old enough to, and Jewish, a woman, old enough to have experienced quotas. And I was locked out of the Ivy League when it was my turn because I was a woman, and I haven't done as well as I would have if I were a guy. But I say to you, speak for yourself. Have you considered that there are other people like me and my late husband? We worked for the federal government because we thought it was an important thing to do to help people. I don't do business with Amazon because of the way they treat their labor. I pay my people the best I can. And I'm a Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders Democrat. Did you think about them? We are different. We do care and we do what we can.
Well, I think that everyone cares. I mean, this is my point in the book. Is I actually don't think that any of the people I'm talking in the book about in the book don't care or are not sincere. The people who write for the New York Times, for instance, and so on, like, I think they're actually committed to
What
the
would you have us
journalistic
do?
I think they take it seriously.
What would you have us do?
So the book doesn't go into like, the point of the book is to understand and describe. I didn't want to provide like, there's no checklist at the end of the book. Just as a spoiler, I end the book on a willfully unsatisfying note because the goal of the book isn't. I don't want to be the next Ibram X. Kendi kind of telling white people how they're supposed to live. But I do think this question of what should we do is important. I think it's super important. And I think it's the question, and it's something that I want to actually talk and think about more. I didn't feel like I had good answers to that, so I didn't just put some kind of cockamamie thing at the end of the book. But I think it's important. I'm wrestling with this myself.
Okay, vote for Bernie. That's what you do.
Okay.
Hello. I'll have to get to the back of the line, ask a second question. Hello. My thesis for my question is that, and I taught argument, debate, and rhetoric at the first integrated school, public or private, in Washington, D.C., which I now understand multiple reasons that they hired me, a white woman from the West who went to college in Massachusetts. My thesis is that I have come to grapple with this question. Grew up in a family of Republican businessmen, thought I was a Republican until I got to college and a friend helped me understand that I wasn't. And so I bring my values to my work, and I had to do a lot of thinking about this because I taught critical thinking. And I'm listening to you very carefully as an English teacher. That's one of my jobs. And thinking that somehow I understand where you're coming from, but my sense is that human beings are far more complex and nuanced in their reactions to finding themselves in elite situations and wanting to do good. I have a Quaker cousin who is living, uh, she's an elite who's living through her actions. So my question to you is, um, did it, are you getting feedback about this, that you have perhaps your strong feelings have kind of painted this with a broad brush at either end of the spectrum, and there's a whole messy middle of us, slowly but surely trying to find our way the best we can through this?
Well, I think again, like the and maybe this just didn't come through in the remarks, but in the book, I walk through just tons and tons and tons and tons of data, and it has this kind of this really long historical arc, and and so the book is actually, it's very nuanced. It paints a very nuanced picture of these of symbolic capitalists. Again, I don't have a I am myself a symbolic capitalist. The book is called "We Have Never Been Woke," not "You Have Never Been Woke," because I'm including myself in this same group. And so, you know, I think it's absolutely the case that people are trying to live their values in various ways. Are they trying to the best they can? I think that's strong, right? But you know, I think they are trying. I think people do try to live their values in various ways. I think that there's a lot more that we could do. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Again, you could just send your kid to his own public school. That would help a lot.
Which I did.
Yeah, but this is what I mean, is there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit like this in principle. And so I think that it's absolutely the case that, again, that most people are sincerely committed to these ideals that they profess. But it's just like, if it entails kind of meaningful risks or sacrifices or changes to our lifestyles or lowering our aspirations, often it's tough. It's tough for us to do those
but
things.
it's not impossible.
It's not impossible.
If
It's
you're
not
determined
impossible.
and passionate.
Yeah. Well, and this is what and so this is the argument of the book, in a way, is to highlight that actually the way things are not the way things need to be. We actually can do things differently. It's a question of will, right?
And I'll just put a footnote. My evangelical brother who voted for Trump, who's going to be 90 in 2 weeks, called me woke. And I said I was not having it. This was years ago. And I said, that does not apply to me.
My mom, fun side note. So my mom is a Republican, and again, like the town I grew up in was pretty red. I talk about this in the intro to the book. But my mom, when she introduces me to people, she's like, "Here's my liberal son," and no one codes me that way. like everything is relative.
Okay, next question.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak tonight. I really enjoyed what you had to say. It kind of took me back to the 80s. I was in social work school then, and I majored in social justice. And the first lecture that ever came about, the professor stood up and said, here's where we want to start. So when we start talking about social justice and problems, we have to start with who really owns this problem, like who takes care of it as an identity. This belongs to me, this doesn't. And I wonder what your thoughts are about, you know, the whole woke world there of like who claims these various things with marginalized people, like who claims prison reform or who claims women being trafficked and who claims that as their authority. And what made me think about that is the first book my professor had us all read was a book called Regulating the Poor by Pivot, and I think they are sociologists. I hope they are, because I know it's your profession. But it sort of sparked my thinking about, does somebody just step in like the government and say, okay, we're going to regulate the poor. We're going to decide if the poor are entitled to dreams or if they are too poor, so they're not entitled to the dream. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about thinking of these big questions, especially social justice. What we do in a culture that we have right now to figure out who really owns this stuff so we don't get really scattered and start running around like, chickens running out of the roost. I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, the ownership of the problems that we have. Do we just toss them in the air and feel good and pass them down the line, or, what do we do? So I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting the things that the book explores or tries to call attention to is that there is this interesting gap a lot of times between between people who are committed to solving a problem and the people that they're supposed to, that they purport themselves as representing or trying to help. That often causes a lot of problems. And it causes, so for instance, take the case of prison reform. So a lot of symbolic capitalists, because we don't have the same exposure to crime, because we don't have the same exposure to the carceral system, it's easy for us to sometimes take really maximalist positions that are like radically out of step with what the people that we're trying to help actually want or need. And one thing that's interesting is that a lot of times when symbolic capitalists affix themselves to social movements, they end up killing them. They end up killing them for a couple of reasons. First, because we often have this set of, we often think that we should be leaders of movements because we think of ourselves as natural leaders or whatever. So if we join a movement, we don't think we should be the one being told what to do. We think we should be the one helping set the agenda or whatever. And that often alienates a lot of longstanding people. And then, but all to say, and so there's this kind of difference between the ways that, and the problem is there's a kind of difference between how we tend to go about politics and how we think, tend to think about politics compared to most other people. And oftentimes during these, there are people who are working in local communities, kind of rolling up their sleeves every day, doing the work on things like criminal reform. There's a guy, Sharkey, he's a sociologist, Patrick Sharkey, who has a great book looking at the crime decline over the 80s and 90s. And he shows that like a lot of these local community organizations actually played a big role in defusing conflict and helping contribute to this crime decline. They don't get the focus. The people who end up getting the focus are the people who are close to the microphones and the people who are good at getting in front of cameras. And so there's often this disconnect between the people who are actually owning an issue on the ground, who are actually doing the thing, and the people who end up becoming the prominent spokespeople and representatives of the thing. And the prominent spokespeople and representatives often alienate people and annoy people and make issues more controversial than they need to be. And this is one of the reasons why once we affix ourselves to movements, we often kill them. We make them more controversial than they were before. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you.
I don't know. Did I answer your question well enough? To speak to it?
I think so. Yeah. No, it was just sparking these different books that we were reading. This is, back in the 80s, but I worked in the field as a social worker and didn't work in prison reform, but worked in women trafficking issues and international kind of justice issues. It was always sort of murky in so many ways that the problem is always there taking over the whole room, but everybody's in the room trying to exert some control and then trying to paradoxically insert, some change. And it is hard. I mean, I struggled with it then. I'm certainly struggling with it now, but thank you so much. I appreciated your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both so much. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming, Dr. Al-Gharbi. Well, I haven't read the book yet. So I don't know if you addressed this in the book, but during your talk, my mind was jumping to the theory of elite overproduction.
Yes.
I was just curious, to what degree do you buy the theory, and what are the similarities and differences of the symbolic capitalist theory to elite overproduction?
You are a very astute. That's so great. So one of the things that the book tries to do is, so after 2010, there was this period of rapid shift in how a lot of people talk and think about social justice. And you can see it in news outputs, you can see it in entertainment outputs, you can see it in political alignments and political behaviors and protests and so on and so forth. Okay, so what the book shows is this period of shifting after 2010 is actually a case of something. There were actually 3 previous periods of awakening just like this one, that played out in much the same ways, like in disturbingly similar ways. When you read the book, like I think people will be troubled. And by comparing and contrasting these cases, understanding it as a case of something, we can get insight into why these awakenings come about and do they change anything and so on. Okay, so on this question of why they come about, one of the key factors I show in the book is that these awakenings, these periods of awakening tend to come about during periods when elite overproduction becomes particularly acute. For people less familiar, elite overproduction is when society is producing more people who have a reasonable expectation to be elites than we have the capacity to actually give them the lives they were expecting. So you have growing numbers of people who did everything right. They went to school, they graduated from school, they even went to the right schools and did the right majors. But then rather than having a comfortable six-figure salary and getting married and having kids and buying a house, they find that things are more precarious than they expected, and they can't live the lives they wanted. When you have growing numbers of people who find themselves in that position, one of the main things they do is they try to indict the order that they think failed them and try to tear down the existing elites to make room for people like themselves. I argue this is one of the important things that awakenings are, that these periods of awakening fundamentally are. Yeah, so the book does engage deeply with the elite overproduction literature. Short answer.
Okay.
I guess that wasn't a short answer.
Don't want to hog the mic, but just one quick question. Put on my free market hat for a second. One thing that jumps to my mind about the elite overproduction hypothesis, and one potential what would be the word? One potential objection to it would be that you still have all sorts of positions among the symbolic capitalists that have very high salaries, which suggests a shortage of labor, right?
Yeah.
So stuff like finance, engineering, computer science, oftentimes there's a lot of demand for these positions that are not being filled. So how do we square that with the hypothesis of that there are too many elites competing with each other for too many jobs?
Well, okay, so so there's actually this kind of there are these moments when elite overproduction is significant, and then it often wanes. And as the elite overproduction crisis wanes, actually the awakenings tend to wane at the same time, which is why you end up seeing these periods rather than just a consistent. So that's one answer. But then the other answer is actually, as shown in the book, actually a lot of the wages and stuff for symbolic economy workers doesn't work the way that you would expect on the basis. So for instance, we have a lot of service workers. We have actually not enough service workers. A lot of employers have a hard time even filling these jobs. Whereas in a lot of other professions like academia, we have a glut of people who are trying to, and we have all these people who are contingent laborers because we have just so many that we're overproducing. Okay, so what you might expect if the classical model held was that the professors would be going down and the service workers would be going up relative to us. That's not what you see. You see the opposite. The professors are continuing to go up relative to the service workers. The service workers' wages are. And so, and why do you see this? Well, it's in part because there are these kinds of cartel-like behaviors that a lot of the symbolic professions are participating in to artificially inflate and hold our wages high despite overproduction. And so the book gets into that in great detail, but great questions, very perceptive questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're almost at 4, so we have time for a final quick question. So please.
Hi, thank you. So I came from Japan 2 years ago, and my big surprise about the country is how intense and intimidating and authoritarian some of those social justice advocates are. So it's really nice to read your book and understand the dynamics, so thank you. So my question is, like, I think no one wants to go down the social ladder. So like, what should elites do? Like, should they be more open to that possibility of going down, or should we at least like admit we are self-centered?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big problems. So Richard Reeves, he's a political scientist, formerly at Brookings. He has this book called Dream Hoarders, which is about, and basically what he argues is that if you want to look at a lot of trends like growing inequality or declining social mobility and things like that, it's not enough to look at the millionaires and billionaires. You have to look at the top 20%, basically. And what he argues is that a lot of us have created these glass floors, basically, for ourselves and our children to prevent downward mobility. But the problem is, if we do this, if we prevent downward mobility, then that limits eventually it limits the ability of other people to move up, right? You can only have so many people at the, and so in order for us to have a dynamic economy where you have social mobility, it has to be the case where you have churn at the top, where you have some people who are born relatively well off and maybe they don't end up that well off at the end, or they do fine, but maybe their kids don't have quite the same position as them. If we actually want it to be the case that other people have a shot, that we have these opportunities, and we have to be at least open to the possibility of, and another thing too, just as a side note, is like there's so much more to life as well than I think one of the problems, one of the things that leads to this opportunity hoarding is because so many of us attach so much to our positions and our incomes and things like this, such that if our kids don't get into the right schools, if we don't have the right kind of job and so on, it's a type of social death for us. And so like, I think part of the issue, if we didn't invest so much of ourselves into these kinds of things, it would actually be easier for us to experience this kind of mobility in all directions without it being so traumatizing to us. Like the reason it's so traumatizing and terrifying for us is because we overinvest in things like our jobs and our status and things like that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so thanks so much, Musa. Congratulations on the book. You'll all have a chance to buy the book and say hi to Musa. I think instructions on that.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for this conversation. If you would like to purchase copies, please head to the register. Please leave the chairs where they are. And if you want a personalized copy, you can start the line right where I am.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you so
Musa.
much.